All right, welcome everyone. You have come to the right place for our event today. What works in designing biomedical research for the community? A theory of change for patient and community-centered science. My name is Francis Shen, and I am just doing the introductions today, and I'll run the Q&A, and I'll introduce both of our speakers. I want to, at the outset, however, let you know and thank our funder and supporter for this project, which is the National Institutes of Health through the NIH Brain Initiative Neuroethics funding mechanism. And this is a grant called Recruitment and Engagement for Advancing American Community Health, REACH for Brain. And this grant focuses on developing strategies for neuroimaging and neuroscience researchers for community engaged research. And today's event is an opportunity to learn from colleagues in adjacent fields about successful strategies that have worked. So really excited about it, and let me get right into our introductions. A co-PI on the Reach for Brain grant will be our first speaker, Helen Hamley. Helen is the founder and administrative and policy principal of Crescent Advising. She brings extensive experience in clinical research using community-engaged methods, as well as public health strategies, and previously led community engagement initiatives at Mass General Hospital and the NIH All of Us research program in New England. We've had the pleasure of working together now for a number of years. Helen's work is great, and I'm glad everyone else is going to get to learn about it today, especially the theory of change. One of the colleagues that Helen has worked with will be our second speaker, Dr. Martha Kenny. Dr. Kenny is an assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesiology and Pediatrics at Duke University School of Medicine. She is many things, including an interdisciplinary pain researcher, so expertise clinically in pain management and the physiology and pain processing in children and adolescents. In addition to clinical work, does research focusing on the risk factors for adverse pain outcomes, especially those with complex painful conditions, especially sickle cell disease. And what we're going to learn about today is how she has worked with Helen and others to use community research engagement strategies amongst underrepresented communities to address sickle cell disease, especially finding ways to adjust those modifiable risk factors. So I will put both of their links to their bios in the chat so you can learn more. And just one word on our the nature of the event. We're a small but robust group, which is great. So Helen and Dr. Kenny will both present, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. You can either, at that point, put your questions in the chat, which I'll monitor, or if you're interested, you can just raise your hand and you can unmute and we can have a conversation. I'm sure I'll have some questions as well. With that, let me thank Helen and Dr. Kenny and turn it over to the two of you. Thanks so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me today. Happy to be here and talk more about theory of change. So again, as Francis noted, this work is funded in part by the National Institutes for Health. But the initial seed for this idea, and also what Martha will be talking about later, was funded by the PCORI, or Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, convening award. So strongly recommend that as a award mechanism for those of you who are looking to do more community engaged science in your research and work with diverse communities as a way to really make sure that your research is community centered and driven. So what I did through that initial PCORI grant, and have now extended through another PCORI grant with Martha and the NIH REACH Award, was really create a way for the community to, in Boston, which we identified as Black and African American members of the greater Boston community, to come together and talk about research in general and ways that they wanted to make sure that research could fit their needs outside of the typical standard of a community advisory board. And so what we did was have people come together for about a year. And that group actually is still meeting now. So that was in 2020, a memorable year to have a convening. And now that group is still meeting together 6 years later to talk about ways that they want to move Black, African American, and in Boston Latinx communities to be truly involved in transformative research that mirrors not only what their community feels is important, but also the expertise within that community. And I'll talk about how this process can reflect that in just a minute. But you can see kind of what we were starting with that kind of base level of engagement for these folks. So feeling overall that, communities are sought after by research institutions for their data, for participation, but that the institutions themselves might not understand some of the reasons why communities can be reticent to provide that data, that engagement back. And it's not necessarily just due to a lack of trust, it's due to a whole host of factors that are layered into a community's history and shared understanding that make it really important to have that kind of baseline beneficial direction setting when it comes to talking about research between communities and research institutions. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Henrietta Lacks and how her family has continued to have their data shared without their participation, their agreement to do so. But we also see that across even recent research endeavors, there has been real issues in getting engagement to community engagement in research. And that isn't necessarily just driven by the community, it's also driven by who the research institutions, who the trials are looking to engage. So in across most different disease type areas, we know that Black and African American, Latinx, and Indigenous populations have higher disease rates of case development than white populations, and yet are continually the lowest represented in clinical trials. This was also seen in the COVID vaccine recruitment. And so just across many different avenues from historical to present day to what happens when persons just walk into a research institution. There are many reasons why communities are saying, you want us to trust you, you want us to sign up, but maybe that investment in what is important to us is not coming back, that return of value. So typically you'll see engagement with clinical research looking like very standard to a simple poster that might have pictures, it might not. It might not have a quick abbreviation that people don't know. If you don't know what NEOA is, how do I know if I'm living with it? If I don't want to read the entire word, if I'm just scanning it, and is really not kind of like human focused. Lots of text, lots of information, but really doesn't give back on what is being engaged with the research going to give back to not only me, my family, but generations of my community. Why should I give you my data? So what we've done at Crescent Advising is see that recruitment for clinical studies tends to dip over time. And we've seen that there's a high uptake in that initial involvement in research. And then over time that goes down and study teams try a lot of different metrics to try to get that to go up to continue study recruitment throughout the phase. But what we've done with my group is see that that can really be broken down into three distinct phases of a recruitment pipeline. So we can see that sharp phase right in the beginning, that initial wave is people who are really highly engaged in research. You don't need to do a lot to get them to come in because they've been waiting for research like this. They're very highly research literate. They are very excited to join in a research study. And so you'll see that spike. Then that wave two has a more privileged population. You have to do some work, but there is actually really great diversity and representation in this group. It's often just hidden diversity. So it might be that a study recruitment team is not asking every single person who comes into a clinic. They might have that implicit bias where they're self-selecting who is involved in the research without realizing it. And if they went just a step or two further by providing those recruitment details to everyone, they would be able to recruit more diversely and rapidly. And what we're really going to be talking today is kind of this third group. It takes a long time. You often hear people talk about, I would love to do community engagement, but it takes so long. I don't know who to talk to. There's no blueprint for how to do this. So we're going to talk a little bit about developing that blueprint. There's great representation. It takes a lot of effort, but as it turns out, the community is actually really excited to provide that beneficial information back to researchers if they're engaged in appropriate ways. So again, this is really just putting in the stakeholders' words what I just said, not just showing up for the ask, having that understanding clarity about what is being done and not just what the research perceive as having value. And that can help with that long-term community engagement in a research study or a research clinic or a research institution altogether. So again, the theory of change process brings together stakeholders from a variety of different backgrounds together to create that vision for what the future of, in this case, clinical research with Black and African Americans in Boston, but again, it can be translated to a lot of different communities, whether that's neurojustice, whether that is a specific town, whether that is a specific population, and really trying to gather what is important to them, and then that can be translated back to researchers and the community alike. So I created a modified version of public health frameworks to ensure that communities can be approached in ways that will benefit their time. So not going up to maybe like the one or two people that you know from a community and saying, hey, I know you, do you want to join part of this research study group? But really trying to make sure that you're creating connections with people who have the time, the knowledge, and the effort to be able to contribute meaningfully to that design for the theory of change model. So we also tracked how people felt with their engagement with research when they first started with the theory of change and where they were at the end. So just a contact of research, just research aware, to really feeling like they were a partner in the research by the end of it. So by having high quality engagement with people who have expressed an interest and are interested in learning more about research throughout, you'll find that you have really greater retention to your community advisory boards or theory of change groups as you develop them. And so the process was we had 12 people join from this community over the course of a month. Again, the majority of this community is still meeting with Francis and I on a monthly basis 6 years later. We pay them at a measure that is commensurate with a consultant fee. And we track their interest in research, their engagement, and that has led into this real crystallization of community ownership through these models that the community themselves have developed. So again, I've talked a lot about the diversity of the group. I'm not talking about diversity in the way that you maybe have historically thought of it. Yes, all the people do self-identify as coming from a historically minoritized group, but they're really brought into the group based on their diversity of thought, their diversity of expertise. If you were only looking for people from one background, you're really going to get gaps in who is how that outcome that you're building is created. So we have people who have a background in faith and ministry, from education, from elder advocacy, from housing and public health, and more, really coming together and talking about these issues at the community level and how we can leverage their results later down the road. And that is to make sure that the community is there at the table, asking the questions, building the research, and building that framework that the researchers themselves can then leverage with community. So that group came together again over the course of 12 months. They built a theory of change. This is a multi-page document that is looking to create a bidirectional and transformational relationship between researchers, institutes, and Black and Indigenous people of color in Boston. So this is just that kind of intro to it. There is a full paper. You can go if you want to see the full theory of change that they created. That is an attachment to the article. And they also created an outcome map. And so again, a lot of times when we're talking about community engagement, it's said there's no like one easy way to do it, and there's not an easy way to do it, but the community has come up with ways that they specifically want systems to come from just being active in the community to being change agents. And you can see it's very detailed. And this was, again, created by this group of community experts. So that rich understanding, that rich expertise really lives at the community level. And it just comes through multiple engagements and interactions to find the ways to build ecosystems that can have that bidirectional benefit, not only for the community, but you can see there's also things that the community has to do to give that benefit back to systems. So to really make it an intermingled system. Again, this is small for the purposes of just showing again how detailed that community plan is, but there is I can put the link to the full paper in the chat. And again, always interested in seeing if there was any statistical significance. We did see that over time, people did increase their trust and engagement with research over time. And we saw, additionally, there was kind of it was really interesting because these were people who are already pretty engaged with research. And if you look at the trust scale, we can see that there was a bump in mistrust midpoint as people learned more about the research systems and barriers that may be in place, but then it got back down to baseline near the end. So again, by long-term engagement, you can really make sure that people understand how the systems are built, you can value their input, and you can pay them accordingly, ideally as well. So this is a system that is really translatable to multiple communities and their intersections as well as disease areas to ensure that community is met on their own terms, that they have a say in building what that community engagement process looks like, and that researchers will take what they say seriously because it's coming again from so many diversity of expertise and thoughts. So with that, I will pass it off to my colleague Martha to talk about how she took this system I just gave an overview with and implemented it for the sickle cell community.
Thank you, Helen. And thank you, Francis, for the invitation as well. I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen and go here. And I believe everybody can see, right? Thumbs up.
Looks great.
Okay, awesome. Well, once again, thank you. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you. And I have the opportunity of really providing a case study or an example of how this theory of change can work in a specific disease, and that is sickle cell disease. And I don't have any slides that actually talks about the pathophysiology of sickle cell because I don't think that's the intent of today's talk. It's really to focus on community engagement, but just to catch all of us up and make sure that we are coming from the same biological understanding. Sickle cell disease is a biological condition. And I'm starting off of that because I actually learned it from my stakeholders to really emphasize the point when I'm talking about sickle cell disease that it's an actual biological disease, especially in the political climate that we're in, that the disease has been so racialized in a way where funding has been stripped from sickle cell grants. And we're in a climate where people are forgetting that this is an actual biological disease. It does impact people predominantly of African ancestry, but is a disease that needs to be treated as a biological disease with an understanding of kind of the racial ecosystem and the structural ecosystem that that disease exists in. So it's a disease in which people inherit and it changes the shape of your red blood cells, which leads to a lot of different impacts on various parts of your body. But the most common symptom that many of you will be familiar with when it comes to sickle cell disease is pain. Most people with sickle cell disease can have excruciating pain, which we call pain crisis. And a majority of adults also can have chronic pain. The pain crisis can come and go, and then the chronic pain is also persistent throughout. And the key point to understand with sickle cell disease is that it's still a life-threatening disease. The life expectancy in the United States for somebody living with sickle cell disease is the mid-40s. And for people who are outside of well-resourced countries, the life expectancy is much lower. In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, 50% of kids who are born with sickle cell disease will not reach the age of 5. So it's an incredibly life-threatening disease. And I'm starting with this slide because this is kind of the context in which we have to think about engagement when we're thinking about sickle cell disease. Some of you may have heard about sickle cell in the context of the fact that we now have gene therapy as a curative treatment for sickle cell disease. And it's actually it was the first molecular disease to be described in the 1950s, and it's also the first to be cured by gene therapy. And this occurred in 2023, I want to say. I remember it was like, I think December 2023, the FDA approved gene therapy for sickle cell disease. And this has been an incredible revolutionary step, like a huge scientific breakthrough. The challenge is that since 2023, if you talk to the majority of individuals with sickle cell disease, has their life changed? Has their quality of life changed? Are they experiencing less pain? Do they have better access to care? Has their disease management changed? And the answer is no. And I'm not trying to belittle what a huge scientific breakthrough finding a cure, like having gene therapy as a cure for sickle cell disease is. But anytime we think of science, we have to remember the science doesn't occur in a vacuum, that science actually occurs in a ecosystem that we have to understand. And that ecosystem includes human beings and the lives that they live. It also occurs within trust environments. If you are, doing scientific research within a condition where trust is a major issue because of historical injustices that have been committed to the community, you have to take that into consideration in how your work would translate. And sickle cell is a story where there have been some breakthroughs, but that breakthrough hasn't always translated to benefit to the community because we have really failed to address a lot of these ecosystems that are also present within the community as well. You also have to think about the social structures that impact the community, the healthcare infrastructure, the fact that a lot of individuals living with sickle cell disease are very disempowered and disenfranchised when it comes to the healthcare system, and also the funding ecosystems. For the longest time, sickle cell disease has been underfunded, both at the federal level and also at the foundation level. And when you compare it to a disease like, let's say, cystic fibrosis, which affects half the number of individuals compared to sickle cell in the United States, but they have much larger amounts of funding, both for the NIH level and also the foundation level. And so we can understand why there's been a lag in breakthrough and how a lot of the breakthrough that has happened hasn't translated to benefits for individuals. And so when you think about a disease that is not just complex biologically, but also complex from a social perspective, a healthcare perspective, historical perspective, engagement becomes incredibly important. And engagement in sickle cell has really been more about late engagement, where I'm, designing a study and I might, have a couple community partners or a couple individuals who are patient advisors that I know a little bit, and I might ask them for feedback after the study has already been designed. Or I might ask for recruitment support. I might reach out to a local community-based organization that I know well and say, hey, we're doing this study. Can you partner with me and just, getting the study, publicized and having people know about the study? And can you support us in recruitment? That's how engagement has been done. But I think Helen's work highlights the importance of how the theory of change model really is focused on early engagement and the tremendous impact that can have. And early engagement is about really building these trusting relationships with community members, patients, people with lived experience, so they can be part of the process of defining the questions that we're asking from a research perspective. They can also help to co-design the studies and identify the outcomes that are meaningful. Because if I've designed a study and I'm looking at outcome X, and I prove that, drug A or intervention A has a huge impact on outcome X, but outcome X is not what I'm worried about as a patient or what, the patient down the street is worried about, then that study is not relevant or meaningful to that individual. And early engagement, especially this theory of change model, also allows us to build a trust infrastructure because we're not coming in with an axe. We're coming in to build relationship first. And so that really helps to really rewire the trust infrastructure, which is so important in sickle cell disease. And then it also allows community co-ownership of the products that will come out of it because you've had the community members involved in every single stage. And so they have greater ownership of what the products that come from it. And so, why is sickle cell just a great example of this? And I'm going to go a little bit faster here. I've already mentioned it. It's an inherited blood disorder. It affects about 100,000 Americans. But while that number is small, it impacts millions of people globally. So it is a huge public health problem across the world. And within the United States, while the number of individuals that have sickle cell disease might be small, the impact is significant. It's estimated that $1.2 billion annually are spent in healthcare dollars, healthcare utilization dollars for individuals with sickle cell disease. And about 80% of healthcare utilization is related to pain. So there's significant, economic burden related to the disease and also personal burden as well. And then in addition to that, there's been just a lag in therapeutic development for interventions that are effective in sickle cell disease. The first FDA approved drug for sickle cell disease was hydroxyurea that was approved for adults in 1998 and for children in 2008. And we didn't have anything from hydroxyurea in 1998 into 2017 when the second FDA approved drug for sickle cell disease came about. So there's been a huge lag in development. And now we have curative therapy that exists, but yet it's still not accessible. And still the conversations about who is going to receive it is still ongoing. And so there's a tremendous, a tremendous research participation gap in sickle cell disease. When you look at interventional studies in sickle cell disease, only about 20% of people who are eligible for the studies actually get enrolled. And so that's a huge problem. That's part of the reason why we have a therapeutic gap in sickle cell disease. And I think that the thing I want to highlight here is that gap, the fact that there's a small number of eligible people who participated in study, is not a reflection of the community. It's not a community problem. It's a research problem. It's a research system problem that hasn't been addressed. And so, how did we, as a team, come together to kind of think about engagement in sickle cell disease? Well, it really started with relationship building. I actually am trying to remember how I initially came in contact with Sickle Cell 101 because it's been such a long time. It was a while ago, several years ago, but I do remember, I think it was related to a peripheral involvement in a project, and I connected with Cassandra, who is the founder and director of Sickle Cell 101, and Stephen, who is their research representative from Sickle Cell 101. And the project that we were even exploring, collaborating on, didn't work out. But then we continued the relationship. They attended a conference I attended too. They held a party. I went to the party. I didn't have any reason to go to the party other than I just thought they were a great group and I wanted to get to know them. And from there, conversations came together. I joined an Instagram Live that they asked me to participate in to talk about sickle cell pain. And when this relationship was built, Stephen and I just started having conversations about pain and sickle cell disease and about research. And ideas began to be birthed from there. And from there, we were connected to Helen from the connection occurred through Dr. Jonathan Jackson. And Helen was doing this great theory of change work related to community engagement. And so we put things together. And this is what happened. Because we had this pre-existing relationship with Sickle Cell 101, I was able to apply for this PCORI Engagement Award with Sickle Cell 101 as a co-project lead. And so the organization was involved from the very beginning in the grant writing process and in the idea phase because that relationship already existed. And so that just made it so much easier. And it's been a great relationship where we continue to work on other grants. We just submitted a huge PCORI grant in January as a team as well. So our engagement starts with relationship. And I think that that's one of the biggest things I've picked up from the theory of change process. And so when we submitted the PCORI award and we were awarded the engagement award, what then happened is we collaborated with Sickle Cell 101 to identify individuals that we could bring together to form essentially a community research partnership board. And we worked with these individuals for about 12 months through an iterative process, several meetings, very similar to what Helen has already laid out. And our goal in working over that 12 months was to really develop a theory of change and outcome map for community engaged research in sickle cell disease. We were able to use the work that Helena had already did as a foundation for the work that the team did and really think about how they're putting their touch on it and really thinking about how it applies to sickle cell disease. And so after working with our stakeholders, there's 8 of them, 7 living with sickle cell disease, and 1 individual is a caregiver of an individual with sickle cell disease. They come from 4 different regions within the country. Several of them represent different CBOs. One of them has never participated in a research study, so that's always been a joy to interact with him. And they range in ages from the late 20s all the way up to the mid 60s. And so it's a very diverse group from different perspectives. And so over the 12 months, they defined a long-term goal or vision for their theory of change. And the goal that they defined was transforming sickle cell research into a system that is informed by lived experience, that's accountable to communities it serve, and oriented towards a universal cure that's accessible to all individuals of sickle cell disease, because that's their ultimate goal. How can we make research work for us in a way that not only does it improve the quality of lives of individuals living with sickle cell disease, but we're able to cure the disease because the cure is now available, right? So all things point towards that. And I'm not going to go through the bottom part because I'm going a little longer than I intended. But what the group then did is also define kind of the context that and structural barriers that are important to acknowledge when we're thinking about what our end goal is. And the context that they highlighted here that was really important for us to acknowledge is that, this goal is occurring it's being pursued in the backdrop of understanding that structural racism and systemic inequities in healthcare and in research have been longstanding in sickle cell disease. Other things that they felt was really important is that there's been historical and ongoing institutional mistrust between the community and also researchers and the institutions that researchers represent. There's a history of having their experiences be dismissed. There's a lot of bias, there's a lot of inequity, and that these things, the issue of mistrust and lack of trust is not just because of historical events, but it is because of what the present day experience is like for somebody living with sickle cell disease. It's ongoing, it's not just historical. And then the other thing that was important for them to highlight is they talked a lot about the acknowledging that sickle cell disease has been chronically underfunded and for a long time has had limited public visibility. That even within the Black and Brown community, there are people that don't know that much about the disease. Our stakeholders, mentioned multiple times, they have family members that still need to be educated on what their experience is. So there's a lack of public visibility and is often excluded from public health campaigns and awareness, et cetera. And then also highlighting that for quite a long time and ongoing, there are practical barriers to participation that people need to acknowledge: transportation, time, cost, et cetera. This goes back to really understanding the social structures through which the disease exists. Unfortunately, it's a disease that impacts people who come from marginalized background. And if you also think about the fact, not only does it impact people who come from marginalized backgrounds, but the disease leaves you with tremendous pain and organ damage. And so it takes away your ability to even progress economically, because a lot of people can't work, not because they don't want to work, but because they're in the hospital all the time. And so think about the impact that it has on families and generations as a result of that as well. So we have to think about this when we're thinking about how we design our studies. And then there's also persistent gaps in provider education and implicit bias in the clinical care. Unfortunately, the experiences of people who living with sickle cell disease when they go to the ED, oftentimes they're labeled as drug seekers. Oftentimes their pain is dismissed. And their pain is undertreated as well. And so this is all the context and the barriers that exist. And I think one thing that it was important for our stakeholders that they felt like is really important to emphasize is that the responsibility for all of these contexts and barriers is not with the community, it is with the research system itself. And so I put some quotes here because I thought they were pretty telling. One quote is that it's not that people don't want to participate, it's that life makes it impossible sometimes. And then everyone always says that it's mistrust, but most of us just don't see what's in it for us. And so the responsibility lies with the research systems and not with the community. And so this is a reframing that is really important when thinking about the context and the barriers within this theory of change. And then also there's a hidden barrier also that the stakeholders also brought about as well, that oftentimes the people most severely affected by sickle cell disease, so those who have the highest disease burden, those who have the most limited social support, the least access to technology, are systematically excluded from any activities, research activities, and even the ability to even lend their voice to influence research. So oftentimes this group, the group that is most needy, is not included. And so this point is really, this barrier is important because it leaves us to really think about how can we equip community-based organizations to really be the voice and to really be able to connect to the people that are often excluded from the process. And so in addition to creating the theory of change, our stakeholders also built an outcome map. And this is a very simplified version of it. We're in the process of working on a paper, and there's a very more complex version of the outcome map itself. But what I wanted to highlight with the outcome map is really, you see here the contexts are listed on the left side, and the preconditions are the assumptions. These are the things that need to occur for this theory of change to work. And so they had several preconditions, I believe 10 of them, and I've collapsed them into different categories to make this thing very simple. And they also then identified interventions or activities, engagement activities or strategies that can be done, which is this middle green box here. There were 14 interventions, but here I just kind of collapsed them because my intent is not to go through every component of the outcome map. And then how, when these interventions and strategies are implemented, these are the outcomes that we can potentially impact. So they had short-term outcomes, middle term outcomes, and long-term outcomes. And they, worked on prioritizing their outcomes. And they felt like these medium-term goals were the most important. And we call these kind of like the missing middle. So these medium-term goals are really about how can we empower community-based organizations to be co-creators of research and not just research arms? How can we also make sure the policy and research designs are really informed by the lived experience, ensure stable funding for different roles such as patient navigators and community health workers, which are really important in sickle cell disease. And also really making sure that dissemination strategies for studies are really community led and really focused on making sure the community is not only we're sharing the results of the community, but we're sharing the results in a way that is accessible. And so the results shouldn't just appear, for instance, in a journal that I will read, or Dr. Shen will read, or Helen will read, but it should also appear on TikTok. That's what we actually had a talk last week. Our stakeholders gave a talk to a different group, and that actually came up that we need to figure out how to take what we've done here and get it on social media. It should be on Instagram. It should be on TikTok. It should show up at community, events, and really making sure that we disseminating things in a way where people actually get their information, because most people are not getting not most. I can say 99.99% of the public is not getting their information from the things that we read in academia. And so we really have to go where the public is getting their information. And they also highlighted some things when they were talking about the engagement strategies, things that need to change within the research culture to make this theory of change actually work. And they talked about things that need to change among investigators, funders, and institutions. And I'll just highlight a couple. For instance, for investigators, the need to really show up for the community, be present physically with no agenda, was really critical and came up multiple times during multiple meetings. Like, don't just come to ask for something, come to build a relationship. And when that relationship is built, you've built trust. And so that when you're coming with a project and you've involved us, you already have our trust. And you have our buy-in. So show up for like the community walks, the community barbecues, the events that are happening, and just build relationships with people. And then also the importance of returning the results to participants and communities to say they want to know what the results are, regardless of what is happening. And then for funders and institutions, two common themes that came up a lot is the need to incentivize collaboration across disciplines, because the stakeholders felt like we have a research culture that is very competitive. Everybody is trying to get that next grant. Everybody is going for promotion. And in sickle cell disease, where the numbers are very small in the United States, we're all competing for the same patients for our studies. And the question is that, are we talking to each other? Are we sharing data? Are we going in for grants together? Are we trying to put things together that will actually benefit the patients and not actually just benefit our institution or our career? So that's something that came up repeatedly. And so, that's just kind of a small overview of the theory of change. And I just want to highlight some practical things that came out of this work that were all the ideas of our patient and caregiver advisors that were on the board. One is doing co-presentations. So they presented at a pain conference that occurred at Duke. And the two people on the right side, the two females on the right side, were part of our community research board. And so it was great to actually have them present at an academic conference and to be able to participate and present in their poster. So that was awesome. They've given also a lot of community and academic facing talks. So for instance, the talk that they gave last week as a group was actually for an academic nursing conference that they were invited to give that talk. And they've given different talks as well. And they're also involved in helping to put together the manuscript for this work which is ongoing. The other thing that came from this group is that it was very important that we take the theory of change because, as Helen mentioned, it is an written document, and then we have the very complex outcome map, which, somebody like me, it will be great. I will read it and, file it away and I will digest it. But we really want to make sure that this reaches the community. And so one of the important things for them is that they wanted to do an infographic that's taken what they've created and really put it in a visual way that somebody who doesn't have a scientific or academic background can read through it and understand it. So this is an infographic that we hired a graphic artist to create based on the work that they've done. And then the other thing that is being worked on is an animated video of the work as well, to be able to share on social media. So this is my second to last slide before my acknowledgments. And this is a slide that I often include in all of my presentations, regardless of what kind of work is going on. And I think it's a quote that I love so much because I think it captures the importance of community engagement in general. That if you want to go quickly, you go alone. And I think oftentimes as investigators, we find it quicker and easier to just do this alone because it seems easier. Okay, if I'm going to work with a community that requires time, that requires money, it requires explaining things, it requires this, it's going to slow me down. So I want to just go quickly and get this done. I want to get this grant in. I want to finish this project. But what this is highlighting is you can go quickly and go alone. But if you really want to go far, and in this case of sickle cell disease, far means improving the quality of lives of individuals living with sickle cell disease and making cure accessible to all people, then we have to go at it together. And so that means we have to look at the community as our partners, and they have to be involved from the beginning. We have to walk hand in hand and do it together. And so I'm going to end there and just acknowledge the people that made this project possible. I'm happy to, take questions if you want to hear more details about the project. But our co-project lead, Stephen Boateng from Sickle Cell 101, of course, Helen, who's a co-investigator on this, all of my wonderful members of the Community Research Partnership Board, we've become friends. We have a text group thread that we just, people just share their thoughts and what's going on and what our next moves will be. They've been just incredible to work with, and they remain excited about this work and what the next thing that will come up. What's the next thing we're going to do, Martha? That's the question that comes up often. So this is their work, and they've done incredible work. And of course, also acknowledge and funding from PCORI as well. So I'll end it there.
Thank you to both for great presentations. One question I had is first of all, it was great to see all those detailed outcome maps. Great to hear so much about the excitement and engagement. In thinking about the ways that this can be applied in neuroscience research, what do you think about the challenges of going from a disease-specific type of investigation to basic research, where even the researchers themselves aren't quite sure and couldn't tell you exactly how this is going to all play out? It's important, and they can talk in science terms, but I mean, even for me, sometimes it's you're like, what you're doing seems very important, but it's untethered from any sort of practical health medical reality that I'm aware of. What advice would you offer for researchers who are in that more basic science bucket?
Helen, if you have a thought,
Start, Martha, then I can jump in.
Sure. It's funny you asked that question because I was asked to talk about this work to our Center for Translational Pain and Medicine, which is primarily basic scientists.
Mhm.
And I think the way I frame it is that whatever, regardless of whether you're working at the bench and working with primarily a rat or mice model, whatever it may be, the work that you're doing is valuable to the community, and the community needs to trust that work. Part of the problem that we trust issue that we have is not just of physicians, it's of science in general. And it's because scientists are so removed and siloed from the people that they're intended to serve. And so I like to frame it as that even if you're working in the bench, your goal is ultimately, we all have the same goal, to reduce human suffering. And so, if your goal is to reduce human suffering, then the work that you're doing needs to be trusted by the community. And so, that may mean that you do community related events that are related to the disease model that you're working with, but it may not be directly tied to your research. And then also, I still think, even as a basic scientist, it's important to engage with people with lived experience because your model is not going to capture an actual human experience, right? And so engaging with people who are living with the disease will actually help you to understand what's missing from that mouse model, what's missing from that tissue model, like, what are the things that, it may even influence how you even interpret the results of your findings because it helps you to understand, okay, this is what sickle cell disease looks like and the experience of living with sickle cell disease in the human side. And this is what it looks like with the knockout mice. And this is what my model explains and doesn't explain. And so when that happens, I think it makes your science better. And then also the trust component. I mean, if we look at Henrietta Lacks and her family, there's a lack of trust, and that was a basic science issue, right? They took her cells. I went to Hopkins, and I did all my training there. So that was a big thing. They took her cells without consent, without her knowledge. And that is still an issue that exists in the Baltimore area and even beyond because of what was done unethically in that setting.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up that to say, like, one of the main quotes that I showed shows the community saying that we don't want to be treated as guinea pigs. And the way you don't treat people as guinea pigs is having them involved from the beginning so they can see the science from the beginning. I think that this model is very translatable to basic science, not necessarily because they will be designing the science that will be happening at the bench, but then it can be known from the community and it'll just make, again, that recruitment that much quicker, that much easier, and that buy-in more knowledgeable. You're also then investing in the community because you're not saying we only want you here to help, get people to sign up. We're here because we want to educate. We want to create job opportunities. We want to sustain that knowledge because by enriching people with the science, by creating that infrastructure from phase 1 all the way to, buying in your local pharmacy, it shows that investment in the communities that the research institutions want to serve.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you, Dr. Kenny. Thanks so much. Have a great week. We'll be in touch. Bye.